messieurs, au nom de l'Institut et au nom du club diplomatique, j'aimerais vous souhaiter la bienvenue ce soir. Nous avons le privilège d'entendre, je crois pour la première fois à Genève, dans sa nouvelle fonction qui n'est plus tellement nouvelle, le directeur général de l'Organisation internationale du travail. Alors, la particularité de l'OIT, c'est un organe tripartite où les gouvernements, les syndicats et les employeurs cherchent des solutions dans une négociation pratiquement permanente. L'OIT a des racines suisses, des racines glaronnaises, parce que le canton de Glaris, des protestants bien pensants comme les Genevois, ont trouvé anormal d'occuper les enfants. Donc ils ont voulu interdire le travail des enfants. Et ils ont réalisé que s'ils le faisaient, ils perdaient en compétitivité par rapport aux Zurichois de l'Oberland zurichois, qui connaissaient aussi, bien entendu, le travail des enfants. Alors, une personnalité radicale de Glaris a pris l'initiative pour créer la première loi sur les fabriques en Suisse. C'était dans les années 60, si je me souviens, 1860, et au moins le problème était réglé au niveau suisse. Cette personnalité est devenue conseiller fédéral, et à ce titre, il a ouvert en 1905 à Bâle un bureau pour les relations de travail, qui est devenu un des ancêtres, ce n'était pas le seul, de l'OIT. Et je pense qu'aujourd'hui, si nous regardons dans les livres d'histoire sur les luttes sociales du XIXe siècle et que nous regardons les situations aujourd'hui, nous constatons évidemment que les problèmes sont totalement différents. Votre prédécesseur, monsieur le directeur général, nous avait impressionnés en nous disant que dans les prochaines années, il y aurait chaque année entre 2 et 300 millions de jeunes qui débouchent sur les marchés du travail. Et évidemment, s'ils sont dans des pays où il n'y a pas de travail, il est absolument normal qu'ils émigrent. Et donc, ceux qui veulent limiter l'immigration feraient bien d'investir dans ces pays pour que les personnes aient du travail. Et je suis heureux de constater que sous l'impulsion de l'OIT, le sujet des postes de travail est devenu un thème de préoccupation depuis une dizaine d'années et que même au G20, on parle des mesures à prendre pour donner du travail aux jeunes et aux moins jeunes, bien sûr. C'est donc un sujet extrêmement sérieux et Guy Ryder est un vieux renard de l'OIT. Il est presque citoyen de Mérin, où il a passé une trentaine d'années. Donc, on l'a assimilé, il nous a assimilés, et il va nous présenter ce soir les prochaines 100 années de l'OIT, en tenant compte du fait que bientôt, il y aura un jubilé très important de l'OIT. Monsieur Ryder, vous avez la parole et je vous remercie d'être venu.
Ambassador, let me first thank the Club Diplomatique indeed the Fondation de Genève, the Graduate Institute, for giving me the honour and the opportunity of speaking to you all this evening. It's great to see so many people in the room, some old friends, who it's particularly pleasing to see here. It's Mark Twain, I think, who said that the art of prophecy is very difficult, especially as regards the future. And with that in mind, as a certain disclaimer as regards the title of my presentation tonight, please don't believe that I'm about to undertake an exercise of futurology and tell you what the ILO will be doing for the next 100 years. As has been indicated, in fact, what I'm trying to do and try to share with you this evening is the challenges which the ILO needs to measure up to as it approaches its own centenary, which it will do in 2019. I want to put it to you that the ILO has a thoroughly contemporary and relevant mandate. It's a mandate for the promotion of social justice in the world, and that whilst that mandate is important, it is not sufficient for the ILO to be in possession of a contemporary and relevant mandate. That's insufficient to guarantee our future relevance. We have to develop the means of action. We have to develop the policies which will enable us to prosecute that mandate in a world of work which I believe is facing extremely difficult challenges. I think it's appropriate to speak of crises in some regards, and where the rate of change is such that our organisation is required to think very deeply about its future relevance, its future effectiveness. As has been recalled to us, the ILO, I think, stands out amongst the community of international organisations, I think for three reasons. The mandate that it has for social justice, this rather specific and particular structure of tripartism. We bring together the representatives not just of governments, but of employers and of working people. And thirdly, we have distinctive means of action, and they are multiple, but amongst them I think that the setting and supervision of international labour standards, those conventions and recommendations which have the force of international law when ratified, stand out as particularly important. Now, I want to look to the future of the organisation, but as I say, to know where you're going, you have to know where you're coming from. So I'm just going to start with a limited amount of history. It's important to, I think, establish what the ILO's roots are. Well, given that I've told you that we celebrate our centenary in 2019, you will have worked out that we were founded in 1919. We were part of the peace settlement after the First World War, part of the Treaty of Versailles, with everything that implies. I think it is commonly assumed, commonly recognized that the ILO was born as a reaction to global conflict and the carnage of the First World War, whose centenary we celebrate the beginning of right now. That is the case. And of course, that's where our basic fundamental principle, that lasting peace can only result from the attainment of social justice, finds its origins. But there are two other factors which I think need to be factored into the equation of the ILO's birth. The first, of course, is the Bolshevik Revolution. If Clemenceau and Wilson and Lloyd George gathered in Versailles and had the ILO on their agenda, they had Bolsheviks on their mind. There was a clear need, and I think it's difficult, you need to look at your history to realize just how imminent the threat of revolutionary change appeared to the leaders of Western Europe in particular around 1919. Extraordinary revolutionary activity, not just in Russia, but around many parts of Central Europe and North America and Australia. So there was a need, I think, in the minds of these leaders to construct for them a better option, the humanization of work, a reformist agenda for the world of work. And the other item, which I think is very frequently overlooked, is that in the course of the First World War, we saw a remarkable growth in tripartite cooperation between workers, employers, and governments. Yes, the roots of the International Labour Organization are also to be found in Bâle, in the labour movement and social movements of the late 19th century. But in 1916, tripartism really took off. And it took off because the Western powers needed to keep their armaments industries working. And to do that, they had to cut some fairly extraordinary deals with organised labour in my own country, in France, and organised labour cashed in those deals with the founding of the ILO in 1919. All of this, I think, deserves looking at and thinking about very carefully. Now, I've said that the founding principle of the ILO, the proposition that if you want peace, you better pay attention to social justice, I think has been a constant and remains with us until this day. Let me just take you through what I think are the three formative periods of the ILO's history. The first is from its formation in 1919 up until the Second World War. The ILO had to deal not only with what Keynes saw as the economic consequences of the peace, we had to deal with the political consequences of the peace and the social consequences of the peace. And if you put all of that together, it was a descent into authoritarianism in Europe in particular, and global depression of a type that we have not seen the like since, although we've come pretty near in recent years. And of course, that ended in renewed global conflict. So a time of turbulence for the ILO, a time of destruction in the world, which led, of course, eventually to the early destruction of the League of Nations. But these weren't entirely negative years for the ILO. It was in these years that the ILO established, I think, two very, very important parts of its continuing institutionality. Tripartism worked, to the surprise of many. Organised labour, employers and governments showed their capacity to work together. And this rather revolutionary idea of the international fixing of international labour standards took root and again was seen to work. So from the time it was founded in 1919 until the time it went into exile from Geneva, an epic story of escape to Canada to survive the Second World War, and then returned to Geneva with the Declaration of Philadelphia in its belt. This was a remarkable period of development for our organisation. Needless to say, after the Second World War, the ILO had to develop in entirely different circumstances, and there were two circumstances which defined, I think, its development for the following decades. One, with the passage of time, was the advent of the post-colonial era, decolonisation and independence. And that was a period in which the ILO moved from a very small membership, 44 countries when it was founded, towards universal membership. We now stand at 185 member states. And that had enormous consequences, and it was a time when the ILO developed its capacities of technical cooperation to give impetus to the newly independent states, particularly in the developing world. But secondly, and perhaps more pervasively and more importantly, the ILO had to work in the cold climate of the Cold War. And there's many of my colleagues in the room here who know better than I do, because they're slightly older than me, that the history of the ILO was defined by East-West conflict for 4 decades. And it's difficult, I think, for those, I lived the last years of that, I think it's difficult even for people who are now students to understand just how completely that Cold War period and the Cold War confrontation determined the way the ILO worked. It was East against West, with the workers, employers, and governments of the East lining up against the governments, workers, and employers of the East, the two blocks hitting head on. And that disappeared overnight. That disappeared in 1989, 1990, overnight. in circumstances of which I'm sure you're all aware, and in circumstances to which the ILO contributed mightily. Because if you think of the struggle of Solidarność, if you think of the struggles at the Gdansk shipyards, if you think of Lech Walensa's struggle, much of that was fought in the ILO. And we have, I think, a very honourable record of achievement in that regard. And this ushered in the post-Cold War era, from, I say, 1990 onwards, which with its ups and downs has continued to the current day and has taken us to where we are today. Now, you might think that, in a sense, having been on the winning side of the Cold War, the ILO would face, in the post-1990 era, sort of a smooth ride, greater acceptance. In fact, I think we've entered into perhaps the most difficult period of ILO history. It's been a period in which people have questioned the very need for the ILO. This isn't a figment of my imagination. In the early 1990s, there was a current of opinion which said, since the original inspiration of the ILO, the fight against the Bolshevik Revolution, had disappeared with communism, the ILO had run its course. There was no further need for the ILO. The spectre had been killed, the spectre that had been haunting Europe. And there was a real concern that the ILO would not be capable of finding a new raison d'être in the post-Cold War era, which was also, of course, the era of accelerating globalization, the predominance of market-based systems around the world. And really, that is a process that's built us up until the situation we face today. The ILO has been challenged and continues to be challenged, and this is where I turn to the future, by a definition of its proper role in a globalized economy, in an economy where market-based systems are the norm, the accepted way of doing things, and we have to prosecute our mandate for social justice in these circumstances. Now that raises a whole series of questions and challenges for the organisation, which I don't think I can go into in any detail, but I just want to tell you where I think that situation has brought us to today, because I am intent upon telling you what I think the ILO needs to do facing the future. I can see the ILO confronted with basically 4 concurrent, mutually reinforcing crises or problems. I hesitate to use the word crisis to define all 4 of these factors, but let me read you out the 4 things, and you can either attach the word crisis or problem or challenge to them as you see fit. The first is a very obvious one, and reference has been made to it: the crisis of jobs and employment in the world. Let me just give you the figures. I'm not going to overload you with figures this evening. It tends to get in the way rather than to assist the message. But there are just over 200 million unemployed people in the world today. And if you're under 25 years old, you are 2 to 3 times more likely to be unemployed than others. The global economy is faced with the challenge of creating no less than 42 million jobs every year, simply to absorb new entrants into the global labour market. At current rates of growth, and we've seen successive downward revisions of growth rates by our colleagues in other international organisations, we're not going to do that. Since Lehman Brothers collapsed, the global jobs gap, that is to say, the loss of jobs which is more or less directly attributable to the crisis, stands at 62 million worldwide. And the bad news is, as we talk about recovery, timid recovery, emergence from the crisis, that global jobs gap is getting wider, not narrower. So perhaps the challenge for the ILO can probably be described as jobs, jobs, and jobs. But there is a second and accompanying crisis, which I believe to be a crisis, and this goes to the heart of the ILO, a crisis of social justice. Now, social justice is not synonymous with inequality, but it coincides very strongly with inequality. And you will all, I think, be aware of the rise in inequality in nearly all of our societies in recent decades. Not a product of the crisis, a product of at least 3 decades of economic and social development. Now, I think there is increasing recognition, and rightly so, that we face a crisis of inequality and hence of social justice in our societies. And I think we should be concerned about it, and we should be concerned about it for several reasons. The first, and perhaps most obvious, and what you would expect me to say, is that current levels of inequality in our societies are offensive to any basic conception of social justice. We should not be living with these levels of inequality. But I recognize as well that that is a subjective judgment, and that different societies have different levels of tolerance when it comes to inequality in their ranks. But let me give you 3 other reasons why I believe we should be concerned about inequality. The first is inequality at the levels we are knowing it today means that whatever level of growth we are able to generate, we are doing less to meet unmet human needs. We put it in other terms. That second $1 million on the monthly income of somebody in the financial sector is less important than the second $100 on the pay packet of a factory worker in Southeast Asia. The marginal contribution to human welfare is lessened as inequality increases. Secondly, inequality is leading to massive underutilization of human talent. It was the chair of the US Federal Bank in the last few days who drew attention to unacceptable levels of inequality in the United States. He made a very important point, and that was to draw attention to the Great Gatsby curve. That is the relationship which shows that the more unequal our societies become, the less human mobility there is in those societies. So people, regardless of their talent, get stuck at the bottom of the ladder and cannot move up. They are denied the opportunity to realize their human potentialities. Unfair and economically extremely inefficient. And the other reason, and I want to stress this too, is that it is increasingly recognized that current levels of inequality are a brake upon economic growth. This is something which is being highlighted by research done not in the International Labour Organization, but in the International Monetary Fund. And there is obvious economic theory issues behind that, but that's another reason why inequality needs to be addressed. And whilst I welcome the increased attention being given to inequality, I think I have to say that the problems of inequality are more frequently lamented than acted upon. Which brings me to the third crisis. It's a crisis of values. The ILO is a values-led organization. We pride ourselves on being a values-led organization. And it seems to me that we have in our societies an increasing resistance to recognition of social injustice, increasing readiness to live with it. I was thinking of how to try to articulate this idea to you this evening, and I found I had drawn to my attention an extraordinary speech given by a Cambridge academic at Louvain University just recently, marking the destruction of Louvain's library at the outbreak, the first atrocity of the First World War. And he had this to say in the context of the founding of the ILO. I'm just going to quote this. He said that today, the idea of social Darwinism is making a comeback. It no longer takes a form as it did a century ago, of the assumed supremacy of certain races and nations over others. Instead, it is associated with a claim to moral superiority on the part of the wealthy and powerful within every society. Those with wealth and power see their position as deserved. They have succeeded in the game of life where others have failed. Poverty and powerlessness, conversely, are seen as the just outcomes and, in a real sense, the choices of those who experience them. We are therefore in danger of recreating an intellectual climate like that of 1914, one in which it would be all too easy for violence and disorder to be justified on the grounds of their cleansing effects. Now, you may or may not agree with that statement, but I think that we could join in believing that there is a crisis of values in the way that we deal and address issues of social injustice. And finally, and I will be brief on this, I think there's a crisis of multilateralism. The ILO must be a committed player in the overall multilateral system of the United Nations. The experience that I can speak of in the ILO is that it is increasingly difficult to generate agreement, consensus on any issue, which makes a real difference. And I know from my conversations with my colleagues that this is the experience of other multilateral organizations as well. And so there's a fundamental question about whether in this globalized environment in which we live, whether the multilateral system is seen as being fit for purpose in addressing the global challenges that confront us all. I worry that we are seeing a retreat from multilateralism. One can easily see a process by which multilateral endeavor is basically abandoned in favor of regional cohesion and action. Nothing wrong in regionality in itself, but it should not be at the expense of the global economy. I'm reminded of the great book by George Orwell, 1984, remembered for many reasons, but remember that dystopia of Orwell was set in a world where three great power blocks played off against each other. It's not a very pleasant example to bring. By the way, Orwell wanted to call his book The Last Man in Europe. As a Brit, I find that quite an interesting irony at the current stage of political discourse. We need to get behind multilateralism, and multilateralism needs some wins. We need, like a struggling football manager, to record some wins. And there are two places where we need to win in the near future. I won't speak of the ILO. We need to win in the climate change processes leading up to Paris at the end of next year, and we need to win in the elaboration and fixing of the post-2015 development agenda in New York next September. They're winnable games, but we must win them. Now, what does all of this mean in respect to the ILO as we look to and beyond our coming centenary? First thing to say is the ILO is subject to the same disciplines as any other public organization or public administration. We have to demonstrate the disciplines, the rigors that is expected of any public organization in times particularly of constrained public finances. In the ILO, we take that seriously. We have worked for the 2 years that I at least have been in post to improve our performances, our management systems, the quality of the services that we provide to our member states. We're upgrading our analytical capacities. We're working on advocacy performance, including at the G20, where I will be in a few weeks. Better services to our affiliates, an organization which is more influential and delivers more value for the money that we are given to do our work. That is a necessary starting point of anything that we seek to do in the future. And then we have to confront what I think are the key challenges of the world of work moving forward. I've mentioned my overall views on inequality and social justice, and let me just try and unpack that notion into some more concrete points, which I think need to stand at the center of the ILO's agenda as it begins the next century, not so as it finishes it. And I have tried to put these in the form of 7 centenary initiatives for our organization, initiatives I have put to our conference and our governing body, and which I believe stands to win the support of our constituents. Let me just run through these 7 initiatives for you very quickly. 2 have to do really with our internal business, and I won't speak very much about them. The first is about the governance of our organisation, the need to implicate our governments, our workers and employers more effectively in the work that we do. I won't labour that point. The second initiative is our standards initiative. Now, I've emphasised at the outset of my comments that I believe that the task of setting and supervising international labour standards, those conventions and recommendations of which I have spoken, is crucial to the prosecution of the ILO's mandate. If we do not have the job and the capacity to set standards and supervise them, the ILO will not be fit for purpose in its second century. The ILO, it is fair for me to recognise, faces a major challenge in respect of its normative agenda, and we're not alone in this in the multilateral system. We have right now a major controversy in the ILO, and in a couple of weeks in our governing body it will be addressed once more, basically around the right to strike, the existence or not in international legislation of a right to strike, but on a more general basis there is a question about the authority of our supervisory mechanisms. It would take a very, very long speech for me to take you through the details of all of that. Suffice to say that the ILO needs to resolve this challenge to its normative function, and it needs to do so in a way which will restore tripartite support for our system and its full authority. We have to do that. The third initiative is the End to Poverty initiative. The ILO is mandated to fight for an end to poverty. With the post-2015 UN Development Agenda to which I have referred, we have the opportunity to make a reality of an end to poverty. It is sobering, given the productive capacities existing in the world today, that 1 in 8 working people who have a job in the developing world, still live in extreme poverty. 1 in 4 live in poverty. It is clear that the post-2015 agenda will focus on an end to poverty. It is our job, and I believe we can do it, and in the current stage of negotiations we are doing it, to put the decent work agenda and to put social protection systems that can end poverty at the centre of that agenda. The next initiative has to do with enterprises. And here I may surprise you. For a tripartite organisation with employers at the table, the ILO has really had remarkably little contact and work with individual enterprises. We tend to work with employer organisations. We've missed, I think it's fair to say, the high tide of the corporate social responsibility boom of the last 10 or 15 years. We have to make good on that. We have to develop relationships with enterprises, work with them in ways that would give sense to their implication in the ILO. And I think we have a particular task to do in tackling the phenomenon and dealing with the consequences of the appearance of complex global supply chains around the world. It makes less and less sense, it seems to me, or it's less and less comprehensive for the ILO to supervise its standards nation state by nation state on the basis of freely ratified conventions when supply chains are cutting across those nation states. Increasingly fragmented and complex processes. We have to follow those supply lines, and that means getting involved with enterprise behaviour. And tragically, we've been given a boost in that endeavour by the Rana Plaza tragedy of April of last year, which cost the lives of over 1,100 Bangladeshi garment workers, most of them young women. In the wake of that tragedy, global business, I think, has accepted that there is a responsibility on business to take care about the conditions existing all along their supply lines. And something that would not have happened without Rana Plaza. We're having a major debate, not this year, not next year, but at the 2016 International Labour Conference on Decent Work in Supply Chains. This is the music of the future. This is an area in which I believe the ILO needs to be a leader. The next initiative, and it's not the least, is what we're calling the Green Initiative. I have said in my first report to the ILO conference that the single feature that will distinguish the second century of the ILO's work from the first century is the transition to sustainable carbon-low production systems. It's a challenge, I think, without precedent for the ILO. I think it's a challenge without precedent for the international community. Up until, I would say, a decade ago, it was extremely difficult in the community of labour, employers, workers, governments, to make the case for the ILO taking on its responsibilities in the prevention or mitigation of climate change. The feeling was still very much that you had to choose between a job or saving the planet. I led International Trade Union Confederation that was for many years unable even to approve the Kyoto Protocol for fear of its employment effects. I'm not proud of that, but that's a reality. That moment has passed. That moment has gone. There is a recognition now that the fight against climate change and the fight for jobs are not conflicting objectives, but complementary ones, and necessarily so. But it remains for us, on the basis of work which I think is well underway, to trace out what we refer to as a process of just transition to a sustainable, carbon-poor future. It is the challenge of the world of work in the coming years. It will be given enormous impetus by a successful deal in Paris in December of next year, and it is our responsibility to take it up. And the good news is that labour, business and government seem to me in the ILO to have understood this and to be ready to respond accordingly. The penultimate initiative, I'm getting to the end, has to do, too frequently forgotten in many conversations, has to do with women at work. You know, the ILO adopted two groundbreaking conventions on equality, gender equality in the 1950s, one on equal pay, another on protection against discrimination. And those conventions are amongst the most ratified in the ILO's normative armoury. They're good, influential, epoch-making conventions. And we have seen on their basis the adoption of legislation in the great majority of our member states, all of which is designed to produce equality at work. And yet, where do we stand? We stand in a world where participation rates of women in national labour forces is typically some 20 percentage points below that of men, where the gender pay gap still hovers around the 18-19% mark on a global basis, and where there are no unambiguous movements to a reduction of those inequalities. Strikes me that we need to take stock of how far we have come and how far we need to go and how we're going to navigate the road ahead. Because I don't think that simply doing more of the same is going to be the right answer. I'm not sure either that some of the innovations that we're seeing in recent weeks are the right answer either. I've seen with a certain degree of alarm, is that the right word? The notion that the best way to reconcile family, private life and professional life for women might be to freeze eggs at the expense of an employer. I think there are better ways to go about it than that. I've seen some other very positive developments. The British Civil Service, not always the epitome of progressive thinking, is going to apparently ensure that parental leave is shared equally between the fathers and the mothers. Great thing, good thinking. But our Women at Work initiative, I think, has to take stock of where we've got to, and as I say, look for innovative ways ahead, not business that should be postponed or forgotten about. And the last word, and I want to leave this with you perhaps more than anything else, is the final initiative, which is, I think, got most attention of all of them, and it's quite simply an initiative about the future of work. What is the future of work in our societies to be? Are we capable of providing those 42 million jobs a year to ensure some semblance of full employment in our societies? Can we do it on the basis of existing policy, premises, and levers? Do we have to rethink the place of work in our societies? Do we have to rethink how we distribute income in our societies if labour markets are giving increasingly unequal outcomes? What are we going to do about the impact, the onward march of technology? Are we really facing with the impact of robotics, the impact of 3D printing? Are we facing a jobs calamity or a jobs opportunity? How is that Schumpeterian equation of creative destruction going to work out? Are we going to destroy jobs? Or are we going to create more jobs? I listened to a very eminent professor in Paris last week who said there is now no technological reason why all industrial jobs which do not require cognitive inputs cannot be automatized. End of manufacturing as a source of employment. So how do we deal with technologies? How do we deal with the dissolution of the employment relationship? I wonder how many young people going onto labour markets really today expect to have a full-time, permanent contract with an identifiable employer. Just came back from Latin America. 6 out of 10 young people who get a job today in the informal economy. Is the employment relationship, as I understood it when I came on the labour market, simply to be consigned to the past? And if so, what comes in the future? These are big questions. I don't have answers for them, but I think that they need to be examined. And that is why, if our governing body agrees in a couple of weeks' time, I will be inviting not just the constituents of the ILO, but research centres, universities, anybody who's interested actually, to join in a major reflection on the future of work and where it is taking us. Not marginal questions, not a self-interested, parochial issue for an organisation which is looking for a future and for a rationale. But I believe issues that should concern each and every citizen in our societies and the organisations in which they find representation. Look, thank you. I've gone on too long. Thank you for listening to me. I'm not sure I've lived up to the title of the speech, but I hope it's given you some food for thought in any case. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Director General, for this clear, inspiring, and thoughtful presentation. I understand that you have still some courage to take a few questions, so the floor is open for questions. There are micros over there. So who would like to start? Over there, yes. No.
Okay, you talked about setting standards, and I believe it is international standards. I comment on the conventions that are already in. My question is, what are the plans to make those conventions ratified? because without ratification, then they're just words in a piece of paper. Second, what are the strategies to extend social protection, especially to the majority who are in the informal section? Because yes, we have formal workers, but the majority are within the informal. So what are the strategies to extend social protection?
As you wish. You just
It's on? Yeah. Perhaps I ought to answer those questions straight away, because they're important but also complex questions. I think you're absolutely right. If our conventions are not ratified, that is to say the legal obligations flowing from them are not accepted by member states, the effect that those conventions will have, whilst not disappearing, is certainly very much less than they ought to be. And I think it's also fair of me to say that in recent years, ratification of ILO conventions has been a source of concern. I think in the economic and political climate that we've known in recent years, where the tendency has been more to deregulate rather than regulate further labour markets, the climate's not been a very favourable one for ILO conventions. So there's a number of things to say. We have to work hard, firstly, to adopt conventions which respond to specific needs and interests in the labour market. There's no sense in adopting conventions on things which people are not interested in. So let me give the example of the last two instruments we have set at the ILO. This summer, we adopted a protocol on forced labour. My colleague Beata Andres, who's in charge of this area of works in the audience. This is a protocol which stands with an existing convention, but which stands very clearly to update the ILO's work to deal with new forms of forced labour, to work on prevention, to work on the compensation and protection of victims. And I hope that that will be ratified very fully. It's a major, major contribution to our normative armoury. The previous convention we adopted was on domestic workers. There are 52 million domestic workers in the world, 52 million. And very frequently, those domestic workers who work in private homes are not even considered to be workers at all, and they fall on outside the protection of national labour legislation. Now, we've already got, I think, 14 ratifications, which is not too bad, actually, in the ILO's speed of movement, and it's made a fantastic difference in many countries. It's empowered the women concerned, it's brought them visibility, it's brought them some measure of social justice. So there are two good examples. But we do have a number of conventions which have not been ratified, which I think we have to look at again to see if they need to be modified, even struck off the books. We do struck off the books out-of-date conventions. And we have a commitment, somewhat obstructed at the minute, to have a standards review mechanism which will make sure that all of our standards are up to date and relevant. On social protection, we adopted a recommendation in 2012, if memory serves, on social protection floors. This is a UN campaign to say, look, whatever your level of development, whatever your financial circumstances, it is within the wherewithal of any nation state to put in place minimum social protection mechanisms to guarantee people the minima of a decent life. Now, utopian? I don't think so. I had a really good example of how this works. I was in Mozambique at the end of last year. We have worked with the International Monetary Fund to put in place in one of these least developed countries a genuine minimum level of social protection. The IMF worked out the fiscal space available, and we designed the social protection schemes. And it's going right into the informal economy. It's reaching out to people for healthcare, for old age coverage, which I think is truly cutting edge and progressive. And I'd love to talk to you some more about how we're doing that and how we mean to go forward. And by the way, we want that social protection floor in the post-2015 development agenda.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Director General, for your refreshing speech. When you talked about socio-economic justice and inequalities, I got the impression that you were talking about inequalities within borders. So I just wanted to find out where your organization is going to position itself in the future and even now with regards to inequalities between nations or between regions, say between the so-called global south and the so-called global north. Where do you position yourself in addressing inequalities between these regions? Thank you.
However I came over in my speech, I should make it clear that I think both dimensions of inequality matter to our organisation. The inequalities within our societies and between them. Now, there are some interesting phenomena taking place in the world. You know, some talk about processes of convergence, you know, that there is a coming together between countries in development and those who industrialise, and this is to the discomfort of some and to the encouragement of others. But I do think as well that there is a real danger of polarisation in some cases. I am particularly clear that the ILO has a major responsibility towards the continent of Africa, where I think we are seeing encouraging levels of macroeconomic growth, 5.5% sustained over a long period of time, but we're not seeing development processes that render the benefits of such growth to the people. So I think the ILO needs to be an actor in the overall development debate. I wouldn't line us up with any one group of countries against another group of countries. I would like to see this as a common endeavour. But this is part of our job. This is part of our job. And, you know, if you look at it on the global sort of level, there's something quite strange and perhaps apparently contradictory. We're seeing the growth of a global middle class. We repeatedly hear reference to the growth of a global middle class, and yet we're also seeing growing inequality in our societies as well. It looks like a paradox. In fact, the two things are different facets of a much more complex process of growth and distribution. So I think we need to be active on both dimensions of inequality.
There are quite a number of questions, so I would ask you to be short.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ryder, for your presentation. A question about reform, if you can elaborate more. Yes, talking about 100 years since 2009, yes, ILO governing body reform or ILO constitutions. So we can say that it is still going on, if you can share with us. And another question also about reform. You are coming from International Trade Union Federation, and you know very well CSA. But since the beginning of globalizations, you see that there is kind of timid reform on trade unions organizations in the globalization area. But ILO can play an important role. Thank you.
I'm not quite sure I'm not quite sure I got the precise question. Excuse me.
So about the ILO governing body and ILO constitutional reform and the reform of International Trade Union Federation and worldwide trade unions federations.
Well, thank God the international trade union movement is no longer my problem. At least it's not my responsibility. You've no idea how relieved I am. All I would say about trade unions is that they need to look to their representative. The big challenge for trade unions is to increase their representative base. In the end, their credibility as well as their strength will rely on being representative. On the ILO reform process, you know, we've gone through 11 facets of the reform process at the ILO. And I would bore you if I took you through all of them. The latest episode of it was trying to coordinate better the work we do in Geneva with the work we do around the world in our 46 offices around the world. But if I could perhaps just crystallize or distill the aim of reform into a sort of one phrase, it is to increase the quality of the ILO's analytical work, to get in place transmission belts which allow that quality analytical work to be translated into effective advocacy and better services to the people that we are there to serve. We're working on all of those things. I've seen, I believe, and all of it's aimed towards increasing the influence of the ILO so that our mandate for social justice is fulfilled. I think I can say that we're seeing results in all of these areas. You know, things in multilateral organizations do not change overnight. They change, I think, over a longer period of time. But I do think we're getting there. I'm not sure I've answered all of the intent of your question, but I hope I've given you some clues. We can talk afterwards if need be.
Monsieur le directeur général, vous nous avez présenté votre vision pour l'avenir de l'OIT. Comment est-ce que vous évaluez l'impact du conflit normatif qui est actuellement cours au sein de l'OIT? Est-ce que vous ne craignez pas que la rupture du dialogue social ébranle les valeurs et le futur de votre organisation?
Well, the disagreement, if that's not too weak a word to describe it, that we have around our normative activities, I have described from its first appearance as an existential challenge for the organization. And it is absolutely urgent that we overcome the impasse in which we find ourselves and restore full tripartite support for our standard system, and that standard system should not be watered down, but should remain strong. I have to say, I hope this is not undue egotism, I believe the ILO standard system stands up to comparison with any other standard system in the multilateral system, both in terms of the setting of standards and the supervisory system that goes with it. And I think we have a record of achievement of which we should all be proud. And the ILO cannot afford to lose that instrument. The debate that we have at the moment, if I'm honest, is a very worrying debate. I cannot, as we speak this evening, tell you when and how we will get out of this disagreement. The governing body of the ILO will be confronted next month with some very straightforward options. Without, again, going into the grinding detail of the disagreement, there is a question about whether the most emblematic convention of the ILO, Convention 87 on freedom of association, does or does not contain or imply a right to strike. And there's a disagreement on that. One option, and it is foreseen in the ILO's constitution, is to take the issue to the International Court of Justice in The Hague. Now, that is a question that the ILO governing body is going to have to decide upon. It is empowered to decide upon by our constitution and can decide upon it in November. If that option is not taken up, there are other options, but at the moment, I think there is divided opinion within our governing body. We clearly have to overcome that problem. You've mentioned also the rupture of social dialogue. I haven't talked about social dialogue, but I do want to take advantage of your question, not just in the context of the ILO's dispute on the right to strike, just to underline the importance of social dialogue in our societies. And I do so because I think it is in danger in many countries. It is regrettable that social dialogue, even where well established in many of our countries, has been subjected by the crisis to a stress test which it has not been able to resist. I can give you some examples. In Greece, social dialogue no longer exists. We're doing our best to get it back in place. In other European countries, social dialogue has been bypassed or also broken down, hopefully temporarily. I even see in countries where social dialogue has been the foundation of economic and social success and resistance to the crisis, major problems in the area of social dialogue. You see what's happening in Germany at the moment. If we've seen some of the problems in other European countries, it's worrying. And this at a time when I think Europe should be in the lead. If there's one place where social dialogue has shown its worth, it is Europe. As an anecdote, when I was received by Swiss Federal Councillor Schneider Amann, when I first took up the job, I asked him what he attributed the success of Switzerland's labour market to. And he said education, research, innovation, flexible labour markets, and social dialogue. I was pleased to hear that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the excellent speech. My name is Klara Polakova-Vendrpluk. I'm based here at the Graduate Institute. My question is short. You talked about the reality of global supply chains and the necessity to engage with enterprises, and also the fact that the current mode of regulation that the ILO uses, which means convention state by state, might not be the most appropriate or effective one. Would you say that the ILO should then develop some standards or instruments that would be legally binding on the enterprises? Thank you.
I find it difficult to answer your question, not because I don't want to, but we have a debate lined up for 2016, which, if I could sort of, if its objective could be summarized in a sentence, it would be your question. It would be exactly your question. What I would say at this point is that a system which relies purely and solely on the country-by-country national obligation, that horizontal, that vertical acceptance of responsibility state by state, but which fails to contemplate this transversal supply chain reality in the world, is going to fall short. It's going to be, I think, tested and be found probably to be less effective than it was in the past. It's not redundant, it's not to be thrown away, but I think it needs to be supplemented by new ways of approaching supply chain management. Now, the ILO does have a number of resources in this regard. We have a tripartite declaration on multinational enterprises and social policy, which dates from the 1970s. It's a fine instrument, it's a voluntary instrument. The debate on constraining regulation of international business, we had it in the 1970s, and you know how it ended in the OECD and in the ILO. But I think that the current reality of global supply chains, the complexity of production systems requires us to go back and have another go at this. And I would predict that this discussion is going to be as complicated as the discussions of the 70s, and it's going to have to be sort of a step change in the way that we do work. Very difficult for me to say, and I should not try to predict how that's going to end up. But we certainly should not be ignoring these phenomena. It's going to be testing, but it's necessary.
Monsieur Sommaruga.
I am Cornelio Sommaruga, a man of the past. I would like to congratulate you, Director General, for your excellent talk. If I understood you correctly, when speaking about the 7th initiative, you tried to explain that the future of work will imply also a dialogue with civil society. I would be very interested to know how you try to organize this kind of dialogue.
Well, again, subject to whatever decisions my governing body takes next month, what I'm very anxious to ensure is that this reflection, which is going to be the centerpiece of the ILO's 100th birthday, is not a reflection which follows simply the standard channels of our normal tripartite interaction with governments, employers, and workers. Yes, it needs to bring in civil society in all of its different and varied manifestations. I absolutely welcome that. There have been moments in the ILO's history when the involvement of civil society has been seen something of an intrusion on the protected space of our tripartite constituencies. I never really subscribed to that view. But beyond that, we need to engage academia, we need to engage the real thinkers around the world of work, business institutes, citizens, in a way which is not habitual inside the ILO. And what has encouraged me is, since I threw out this idea of a future of work initiative, and we have yet, of course, to put it into practice, and that's the acid test, there's been enormous interest in it, and I take advantage to try and engage all of you in it. For me, it's come one, come all. I really want this to be as open a reflection, as engaged a reflection as it's possible to have. The ILO can only gain from bringing everybody's views, talents, perspectives to the issue. I don't have the template of how we're going to do that yet, but hopefully if we have this conversation in the beginning of next year, I'd be in a position to give a bit more substance and structure.
Last question.
Donato Kiniger, good evening. Director General, thank you very much for the envisioning presentation that you have given, with clear and convincing arguments, and with also targets, new targets for the organization that you have spelled out very, very clearly. You also made reference at the beginning of your presentation to the foundations, to the constitution of the organization. And you said, you've quoted practically the Constitution saying there is no peace without social justice. If I understood correctly, I think this is one of the key sentences in our organization that we use, and it's core to our mandate. Now, you have already delineated so many challenges, and all challenges obviously contribute to resolving the main issues at stake. But when we talk about employment and work relations globally, with so many crises around the world, with so many divides, with so many conflicts, my question is, in your opinion, what is the future of the organization in promoting peace? What the organization will do in the next 100 years to promote peace universally? Thank you.
I should point out to those who don't know, and in view of the nice things he said, that he's one of my employees, so there's a potential conflict of interest there, Donato. And you're asking me what the heck are we going to do in the next 100 years? Look, if we do our job properly, in all of the areas that I've tried to outline to you tonight, we will be contributing to peace. We're not the blue helmets. We are people, we are an organization which can, and I think history adds force what I'm saying, this is not self-justification. History shows that where we get these things right, where people have an opportunity to fulfill themselves through decent work, where young people have an option in life, then we are contributing massively to the stability of our societies and to the preservation of global peace. That initial proposition from 1919 has held good for nearly 100 years. It will hold good for the next 100 years. That's my prediction. I won't be here to see it. None of us probably will be. But that's the reality. And look at our recent history. Where has unemployment been, in the long term, the highest? Where have opportunities for youth been the most blocked in the world? For decades. The Arab world, North Africa and the Middle East. And that's one of the reasons, not the only one. That's one of the reasons that we're seeing what we're seeing. Nobody wants to be a harbinger of instability and conflict and of violence. But one thing is sure, if we don't get some of these work-related issues right, I think, regrettably so, we have to be worried about the stability in the future. So we have to do our job properly, and in that way we'll be contributing with others to the preservation of peace, which I'm sure we all subscribe to.
So there were other questions, and this is a clear indication of how much interest your lecture has raised among us. And before inviting everybody to join for a drink upstairs at the cafeteria offered by the Fondation pour Genève, I would like really to thank you so much for your lecture. I mean, we feel very privileged that you came to share with us your views and vision of your organization, which is the heart of anyone here who is interested in the future of humankind. So thank you so much.